class, we are reading chapter 11 in Ingold called The Temporality of the Landscape, which is, I think, a rather curious chapter. It works within the book to a certain extent, but it also might be considered a kind of standalone or something. It seems to be able to be on its own in a way, or perhaps was written to be on its own before it was incorporated into the book. On the one hand, Ingold gives us this tantalizing idea that somehow he's going to say something about archaeology, and that the practice of archaeology is itself a form of dwelling, and this will be a way of integrating archaeology into, as he puts at the beginning, social or cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, and archaeology form a necessary unity. But to a certain extent, I would say that that tantalizing idea of unifying archaeology is perhaps gets submerged into a lot of other details about the idea of landscape and taskscape. He returns to archaeology at the very end, but I don't think it fulfills that tantalizing objective of unifying archaeology with sociocultural anthropology. There are some interesting things in here, though, that are worth, I think, at least mentioning and maybe trying to suss out a little bit. So he's talking here about the temporality of the landscape, and he spends a lot of time talking about what is the landscape. But he first spends some time talking about what the landscape is not, which is perhaps as or more instructive as what the landscape is. So he starts by saying that the landscape is not land, which I think is one of the more interesting things that he says here, is that you can ask how much land you have, or how many acres of land, or how much it is, but you can't say how much landscape is there. So land can be quantitatively, you can say I own 6 acres of land, so it can be quantified and homogeneous. But the landscape, Ingold says, is qualitative and heterogeneous. You can't ask how much landscape you have. There's not a more or less, there, not how much of it there is. So I think if we only think about that, that's in itself interesting. He then says that it's not nature, and I've put nature in quotes. He's talking about that nature which he has talked about before, the idea of nature as being something that is outside of the human, that humans are either above or distant from it. And so he is saying here that the landscape is not just something abstract or outside or alien to human beings. He says on page 191 that it's the familiar domain of our dwelling. It is with us, not against us. So it's not that we're not in a man against nature situation, as Gabe says, but it's also not simply on the side of culture. It's not just us. There's all kinds of stuff out there that we're doing and is incorporated in it. And so it is no less it is with us, not against us, but it is no less real for that. And through living in it, the landscape becomes a part of us, just as we are a part of it. So it's not nature in that abstract sense of something outside of people. And it's not space in the sense of being some sort of abstract cartography or a geographical space that we put on any cultural meaning that we want to. And so again, some of this is a little, I mean, he's arguing with people who are saying that there's this space out there. On page 192, he brings up the Saussurean, Ferdinand de Saussure's linguistics, which would have us think that all the meanings are like on a double piece of paper, so that the word and the concept are the as you maybe it's best to read what this is. The Saussure's sheet of paper. Picture thought and sound as two continuous and undifferentiated planes of mental and phonic substance, respectively, like two sides of a sheet of paper. By cutting the sheet into pieces, words, we create on one side a system of discrete concepts, and on the other a system of discrete sounds. And since one side cannot be cut without at the same time cutting the other, the two systems of division are necessarily homologous, so that to each concept there corresponds a sound. And so, again, Ingold is here arguing, difficult to parse, but arguing against that idea that we are simply pinning meanings onto space, that what we're actually doing at the landscape is gathering meanings from it. And so I have a few question marks written here in the margins because some of it is as you said, difficult to get. What I think here is Ingold says that in some ways the landscape is kind of like what we've previously talked about in terms of the environment, that the landscape is in some ways a parallel to the environment. In fact, he asks on page 193, is it not then identical to what we might otherwise call the environment? Certainly the distinction between landscape and environment is not easy to draw. And he goes on to say that in some ways, it's kind of like we are bodies in a landscape, which are like complementary terms, in the same way that he's earlier argued that there's no environment without an organism, and the organism is in the environment as sort of an inseparable whole. So the bodies, we're bodies in a landscape, and I think for me the distinction possibly here is that when we can analyze organisms in an environment kind of from a distance, you might say, or we can look at them abstractly and say, aha, we can posit that the organism is inseparable from the environment, and we can describe an organism in an environment basically as an observer. But in order to understand both body and landscape, we would have to talk to the people who are in that place. I mean, we can describe it, but it really has a lot to do with the meanings the people themselves are gathering, if we want to say gathering from. We can observe this environment, but to really understand it as a landscape, we have to know what the people themselves are imagining and thinking in that place. So I think these two terms, again, are parallel, but you need a little more, perhaps you need a little more anthropology, you need a little more talking to people in them to get to that idea of the landscape. In part, that's because the landscape is part and parcel of what Ingold calls a taskscape. And again, this then becomes perhaps even more difficult to parse because he is contrasting this. He's talking about the taskscape as a form of temporality, as that we are trying to accomplish certain tasks in our place, and we're trying to do them socially. But he, like land, he's trying to contrast that with this idea that there's sort of a series of historical events that can all be matched up with a certain year and perhaps quantified. And so this, again, gets very difficult because he starts talking about chronology in the A series and the B series on page 194. I think for me, the most important part is just to start thinking about how, in some ways, what he's trying to describe is how people try to do tasks, perhaps before we had all these clocks around, not according to clock time, not according to astronomical time, but according to what needs to be done. And this is an argument that we will take up on, in a later chapter, and hopefully it will come out better there. But the idea here is that we do these tasks together, we do them socially, and they have a kind of they are tasks, not assignments. And so perhaps we can differentiate them between what we do in, say, my class, which, we start at a certain time, 2:30, and you're supposed to have a certain thing that is done by a certain time. And in some ways it becomes more like a quantified job-like, money-like time quantification of things than this idea of having a task, which is something that we do together and we accomplish together. One of the perhaps best ways to think about the task and the taskscape is the idea of, or is how music works. And this starts on page 196 at the bottom, where he talks about more than any other artistic genre, music mirrors the temporal form of the taskscape. So he then qualifies that on page 197 to say that there's cycles, rhythmic repetitions in music, but they occur more essentially rhythmic rather than metronomic, which is to say they are in a social coordination with other people in the environment more than they are against a clock or against a metronome. So I think that the music, the movement, on page 197, music exists only when it is being performed. It does not pre-exist, as is sometimes thought, in the score, any more than a cake pre-exists in the recipe for making it. So this is very similar to, go ahead, yeah, no problem. So the idea of music here is that it exists when it's being performed. Doesn't exist outside, or it doesn't pre-exist in the notation or the score any more than a cake pre-exists in the recipe for it. And this is actually something we talked about. We've talked about this before in various places, but especially in the last class when we're talking about chapter 9 as culture being in the Goetzian idea of plans, recipes, rules, instructions for the governing of behavior. And the idea that what anthropology is after is those recipes that people use. And Ingold is arguing against the idea. He doesn't argue that there are no recipes, but that there isn't, you have to make the cake, the music has to be made. It doesn't exist prior to its making. And everybody's going to make a different cake or a different recipe, even if they're working off the same platform. So he says here that the landscape is like a painting, but not so much the finished paintings that we're used to looking at in museums, but the ways in which, as in many other societies, the performance is what is most important, and the actual object is perhaps not as much. And so it's the idea that the landscape is painting, or what we can see as a performance, and that, or as Ingold puts on 199, the landscape is the congealed form of the Taskscape. So we're all doing our stuff and as we are working on things, it becomes part of the landscape. Which there's on page 199, does enable us to explain why intuitively the landscape seems to be what we see around us, whereas the Taskscape is what we hear. So there's a sense in which the landscape and the Taskscape are essentially, or could be considered to be one, and that there's a temporality to them in which things are in some ways constantly in motion. And there's an interesting passage about this on page 201, which kind of brings us out right before we get into the painting. What appear to us as the fixed forms of the landscape, passive and unchanging, unless acted upon from outside, are themselves in motion, albeit on a scale immeasurably slower and more majestic than that on which our own activities are conducted. So Ingold, I think, here is saying that we can see our motions, our ability to move in our everyday life, but the landscape is actually in motion as well, except it's on a bigger and slower scale. Imagine a film of the landscape shot over years, centuries, even millennia, thousands of years. Slightly speeded up, plants appear to engage in very animal-like movements. Trees flex their limbs without any prompting from the winds. Speeded up rather more, glaciers flow like rivers, and even the earth begins to move. At yet greater speed, solid rock bends, buckles, and flows like molten metal. The world itself begins to breathe.